This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 66 of Here's How. Most Irish people only ever hear the word libertarian if they follow minor US presidential candidates, but there's at least one Irish elected politician who identifies as a libertarian, and I've tracked him down.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Councillor Keith Redmond. Keith stood for the Dáil for the PDs in 2007, and he was elected for Fine Gael as a local councillor in 2014. Later he left Fine Gael and joined Renua, and then left Fine Gael again. I know, Keith, you've described yourself as the PD's Hiro Onada, who was the Japanese soldier who was found fighting World War II 30 years after it ended. Why did you call yourself that?
I suppose when I think about it, I suppose I am a kind of I feel almost like the last classical liberal out there. You know, I would have seen the Progressive Democrats as a classical liberal party, and they would have been in favour of social liberalism, individual liberties, and then also market liberalism, so lower taxes and, you know, incentivizing individuals. So they were kind of a quintessential classical liberal party. Now they're obviously gone, and since they've been gone, we haven't really seen a party as pure in that political philosophy since. And so I suppose in my little, you touched on it there, in my wanderings politically through Fine Gael and then into Renua, I've been searching for that band of classical liberals, but I haven't found one yet. So I'm the last soldier, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, and you talk about classical liberalism, and in the US the term used is typically libertarianism. When you say liberalism and classical liberalism, you're not meaning something exactly the same as it might be meant by other people. Can you give Irish people who might not be so familiar with it a rundown on exactly what libertarian political philosophy is?
So a libertarian or a classical liberal is somebody who believes in the primacy of the individual over the state, and that the individual is born with inherent what we call natural rights, and the state doesn't have the authority or power to usurp them. So, for example, I mean, because you happen to be born in Ireland does not mean that the Irish state has the right to claim ownership, for example, of your ability to work, or your ability to travel, or your ability to marry, or your ability to do any of those individual contracts that are really none of the business of the state. So a typical example would be, it crops up in lots of different ways, but a typical example would be in the current conversation about student fees. What we're seeing is people saying, well, no, the state should pay for the fees for students to go to third level. And everybody says, oh, that's fantastic, you know, free fees, that's great. But we really believe there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it comes very quickly afterwards. The state say, well, yeah, you can have free fees, but we will then say you have to stay in the country and pay taxes for, you know, X number of years, or work in our education system, or work in our health system, or, you know, we'll claim ownership of you because we have paid your fees. Mm-hmm. So that's why I would be in favor of student loans, because you then own yourself. You're paying for the service that you're receiving, the education, you're benefiting from that, and then you're paying it back with the money that you earn from that education. So therefore, the state claims no ownership of you. At the moment, we, as you probably are aware, pay 49% tax on anything we earn over €34,000. So we have the highest rate of tax on the lowest income anywhere in the world. So we're the hyper tax land. So they're effectively claiming half of what you do when you go out in the morning once you've earned €34,000. And again, that's an egregious kind of concept to somebody who's a classical liberal libertarian, because you do believe that you own yourself, and, you know, in as much as we all would like to pay some dues to the state for the provision of services, roads, all the rest of it, that's all fine. But when you're getting to the stage where the state are abusing their privilege to tax to the point where they're taking half of what you earn, that's really getting into the realms of again, the state claiming ownership of an individual.
Okay. I think it's fair to say that the view of libertarianism that you have, and it's by no means you, although it's probably a fairly a narrow pursuit in Ireland. Internationally, it's quite a widespread philosophy. It would be fair to say that that philosophy has an extreme aversion to regulation. Would I be right?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, regulation always sounds fantastic. I mean, traffic lights are great, aren't they? I mean, you arrive up at a junction, you don't want to go straight through the traffic lights and hit somebody else, so they don't want to hit you. So therefore, we need some traffic lights. And so regulation seems perfectly reasonable. A roundabout works just as well, so you don't really need the traffic lights. And then all of a sudden, maybe the roundabout isn't needed because when you arrive up, if you look left and right, they look left and right, and you have a mutual desire not to hit each other, maybe you don't need the traffic lights at all. So that's just a simplistic example of where everybody initially thinks, oh, regulation's obviously, vital. And then when you start to analyze things, you kind of go, well, do you really need the state to regulate everything?
Yeah, you're giving a simplistic example. Give me a concrete example of regulations that you would wish to abolish.
Where to start? So, I mean, let's talk about public health. Okay, so we have a situation now where they're going to bring in a new public health bill, alcohol bill. Mm-hmm. And this has been coming through the Dáil now for some time. And the concept is, as is always the case, we have a problem. I'm a politician, so something must be done. This is something, so this must be done. So politicians have to be seen to be busy to appear as though they're useful. So when they see something like, we drink alcohol, people get drunk, they fall over and they cause problems, and therefore, politicians should do something to fix that. So the public health alcohol bill coming through is going to introduce things called minimum alcohol pricing. Now, what this means is the state is going to regulate the price of alcohol so that a unit of alcohol will not be allowed to be sold for less than X. Mm-hmm. Now, units of alcohol, as you probably know, differ depending on the drink. So, there'll be 2 units of alcohol in a pint of beer, for example.
We covered this on the podcast previously. It would mean the minimum price for a bottle of whiskey would be about €28.
Yeah, and a bottle of wine would be about 12 or €14. So this is the state regulating the price of something because they think that something needs to be done, and this is the thing that needs to be done. Now, all that happens in this situation, of course, is that the state is creating a black market for alcohol in exactly the same way as they've created a black market for cigarettes. And so we're going to see alcohol smuggling bringing us back to the 1930s in Chicago, and we're going to create a few Al Capones by doing that. So the state is saying, well, look, you can't be trusted. You're an adult, but you can't be trusted to drink alcohol. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it more expensive so that you can't drink as much alcohol because we don't think you should be able to do that. Now, as a libertarian, that absolutely rankles me because I believe in individual rights, but also individual responsibility. So if you want to sit and drink wine all day, every day, that's entirely up to yourself. It has nothing to do with the government stepping in and, trying to live your life for you. But the responsibility on you then is that you have no right to turn around to the state and say, well, I want to sit around drinking alcohol all day, but I want you to give me free money to do that. So there are rights and responsibilities for everybody, but you can't. We're now entering a phase, I think, in Ireland of right to water, right to this, right to that, right to television, right to whatever you're having yourself, but no responsibility. So we don't have responsibilities for any of the things that we want for free. We just think that someone else will pay. Someone else will have the responsibility.
Let me come in there then, Keith, because in general, I tend to agree with the thrust that people should take responsibility for their own lives and they shouldn't have excessive government interference in their lives. But there is such a thing as externalized costs, and without getting too much into the technicalities of it, if I'm walking down the street and I finish a packet of crisps or finish drinking a can of Coke, God help me, and I throw the rubbish over my shoulder, I'm not the one who suffers most of the cost of my behaviour. And there's a whole range of activities in society where you could say people can just take responsibility for their own behaviour, but when their behaviour has a negative impact on other people, or where the huge majority of that negative impact falls on other people, isn't it fair that society, that's to say the government, should step in and say you're not entitled to impose that cost on other people?
Yeah, that is the kind of moral authority that governments use, the so-called negative externalities. So they introduce what are called Pigovian taxes. So the tax on a negative externality, you don't want to get too technical, but basically, as you just described, you throw something over your shoulder. So the government has the right to tax you on what you're consuming on the basis that you're creating kind of detritus behind you.
Or to regulate you and say that you're not allowed to do that.
Not allowed to even drink the product or have the product.
Well, no, not allowed to toss the rubbish over your shoulder.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have no issue with you regulating the tossing of rubbish over your shoulder. I mean, I'm not saying that people should be allowed to, poison a river because they want to, they have a particular penchant for kind of developing strychnine in their farmyards. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying to you is that the moral authority and this negative externality stuff when it comes to public health is, it used to be the case that the government used clerics as their moral authority. So we were all reprimanded from the pulpit for drinking too much, and Father Matthew and all these boys, the temperance movement, and, it was all very kind of, it was the purity of the human spirit and all this stuff, right? So the clerics used to be the moral authority. Now the government are using the medics as the moral authority. So they're saying, this will give you cancer, this will cause liver disease and all this stuff. And so they're using that moral authority. Something must be done, this is something, so therefore we must do it. And the negative externality they use in that situation is, well, you're using our public health system. Okay, so you're using
stick with the example that I gave you. You're using a public street as your rubbish bin.
Oh, right, okay. So I was getting back to the public health alcohol lobby bill. That's what I was talking about. So the rubbish bin, yeah, okay. So I mean, you're saying that you should have laws against littering, and I agree with you. I don't think there's a problem with having laws against littering. What I'm saying is that does not give the government the right to then ban cans of Coke.
Sure. Well, for example, one of your former party leaders, Mary Harney, was probably most famous for for banning smoky coal in Dublin. How would you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I don't really have an issue with regulating some things. I mean, the notion that a libertarian or a classical liberal is against all regulation is fanciful. I mean, I'm saying to you that regulation is used as the kind of the stick to introduce more and more draconian regulation. So because one thing is a good idea, therefore all regulation is a good idea. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that, you shouldn't be allowed to set a fire in your front garden that could catch fire to your neighbour's house. That, I'm perfectly happy with that regulation. But what I'm saying to you is that shouldn't be used then as the reason why we get down to banning the minutiae of people's diets.
Okay, and that's fair enough. I should say, I don't think it's entirely fanciful. I have talked to libertarians who say that the only acceptable regulation is to sue the person who is doing you harm. That's why I brought up the idea of the Clean Air Act. You would have to sue however many 100,000 people who are burning coal in their fireplaces for your asthma, and that seems unrealistic.
Yeah, no. I think the notion that you can have individual tort rights against the people who are, damaging you personally.
For people who don't understand, tort rights would be just the right to sue somebody in court.
Yeah, that is fanciful when it gets down to environmental issues. But again, you see, it's really important, and I always kind of stop people when we get into these conversations to point out, because you can come up with one example of a good idea when it comes to regulation, that should not be an open season then, and we must regulate everything.
And would you accept the corollary that because you can find an example of a bad regulation, that doesn't mean that all regulation is bad?
Correct, and that's just what I said to you. I'm very happy with some individual regulations that have, for example, negative externalities on an entire population as a result of your individual behaviour. I'm fine with that. What I'm not fine with is using that as the excuse then to say, well, because you allowed that, you therefore are lending us the authority to regulate every aspect of your life, because one regulation means that all regulation is good. So it's really important that, it can sometimes get into a situation where it's a kind of a gotcha moment in a debate with people when you're discussing libertarianism or classical liberalism. They kind of say, well, I'm spotting a hypocrisy here in your philosophy, and therefore your entire philosophy falls. No.
Sure. Well, we have a more intelligent audience than that. We can talk those things out.
Absolutely. And I'm not an anarchist, and it's very important to distinguish between the two. An anarchist is somebody who believes in no state at all, no state regulation, no state laws. No, and that's not with libertarianism, and it's often confused with that, and deliberately so, I think, by opponents. Libertarianism is about the individual. It's literally about saying the state should only be able to step in and produce a law or a regulation that prevents you from going about your business when it can be proven that what you are doing is harming other people. So we have this kind of notion, it sounds a little trite, but a libertarian believes that you're free to swing your fist until you reach somebody else's nose. So I'm very happy to have a situation where laws are created to prevent someone from harming me and from me harming someone else. And that's not a problem at all. That's not a conflict with libertarianism or classical liberalism.
Okay, one other issue that I'm not necessarily laying it at your door, but one other issue that libertarians seem to me to have a blind spot on is their enthusiasm for freely negotiated agreements. Sometimes agreements are not nearly as freely negotiated as they might be. And I think perhaps Michael O'Leary might be one of your heroes. He was certainly a hero of the PDs. But do you really think that maybe a 19-year-old on minimum wage has equal negotiating power as a billionaire airline boss when they're negotiating their pay and conditions?
No, and that's not the point of the argument. Equal negotiating power never occurs in a contract. I mean, you always have one person having more influence, more power. That's not the point of a voluntary contract. The point of a voluntary contract is you reach a situation where you're happy is probably the wrong word, but you are agreeable to doing an activity for a perceived benefit. Mm-hmm. So it's not a situation where everybody's, whistles off into the sunset delighted with themselves. Most compromises and most voluntary contracts are the result of a situation where you go, well, I'll tolerate that because I'm getting this. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And then there's no way I would ever suggest that a billionaire and somebody who's on low wages is the same kind of financial clout, not at all. But again, a billionaire who's dying and, dying of an incurable disease, and a 19-year-old who's on low wages, he has advantages over him. So everybody has an advantage. I mean, the young person might be there to kind of take care of the older person in their dying days and getting paid for it. Now, they may have to do particularly despicable things. They may have to clean up after somebody who's dying and change them and put them in showers and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But they're being paid for that. And the notion that, a contract can only be considered voluntary when there's an equal negotiating power between the two parties, that is fanciful. Okay,
setting aside the idea of equal negotiating power, if the negotiating power is so disparate that it creates a relationship that is morally repugnant to the overwhelming proportion of society, is the state not entitled to step in?
No. And that is the very moral authority the state uses, and I absolutely disagree with that. So if an individual wants to engage in a voluntary contract,
okay, well, let's put it this way. If
Could we just stick to your initial one?
We'll stick to that. But I want to give an example in extremis. If I, as a very wealthy man, had kidney disease and I wanted to get a replacement kidney, and I flew to a third world country and I found that some woman had a suitable kidney to donate, and that the operation would risk her life, but she needed the money to make sure that her children would survive. At that level, she's willing to do it, but at that level is a contract not so abusive that it would justify the state stepping in?
But why would you need to fly to a third world country? So, for example, let's take your example. So, there's somebody dying, requiring a kidney here in Ireland. They're a billionaire. Mm-hmm. And you personally have a kidney, a spare kidney, if you like. We all can get by on one. Mm-hmm. So you've got a spare kidney, and you have a very poor financial situation. You have a reason to, let's say the guy's going to give you €100,000, and you have a reason to want that €100,000 to support your children, to start a business, to get a home, to do whatever it is that you want to do with that money. Mm-hmm. What business is it of the state to step in if you're both voluntarily entering into that contract?
So the key point there, Keith, is that there is nothing so repugnant that you would think the state would be justified in stepping into an agreement between two people.
As long as the two people are engaging in the agreement voluntarily and they're not being coerced, and I don't mean being coerced by some long list of social justice warrior kind of criteria. I'm talking about somebody who's not actually at a gunpoint, if somebody is doing that voluntarily, they're gaining a benefit from it. What business is it of yours or mine to say, well, no, you're wrong. You're not entitled to make that contract, because we find it morally repugnant.
Keith, do you view consent as binary? Can you not envisage of a situation where consent, where voluntariness, so to speak, would be compromised?
It's compromised in every single contract. So, for example, my first job was I was an attendant in a toilet in a nightclub. So I used to clean the toilets. Now, I wasn't exactly skipping to work and delighted with my job, but I was getting paid at the time £10 a night to do it, and I was gaining the advantage of that. And I was doing it for that reason. I was going through college and I had that money. So, like, other people would find it morally repugnant that A, the job I was doing, or B, the remuneration I was receiving. That's nobody else's business. That's my business. So I don't see why. Generally as well, another thing I find about this is that, having grown up in a working class background, I really take exception to the people who say that poor people should have X, or poor people should not be allowed to work unless they, for example, minimum wages I'm utterly opposed to. So a poor person shouldn't be allowed to work until they hit €9.55 an hour. Now, what it means is not that they will suddenly be given €9.55 an hour to do a job, just that the job won't exist and they'll be on the dole. And the people who tend to come up with that stuff are normally the kind of self-loathing middle-class lefty who really just kind of thinks, well, I know better what the working class person needs than they know themselves. And again, it comes back to this paternalistic notion that the state should step in when they find things morally repugnant that individuals want to do. If you want to go to extremists, I'm in favour of sex work. I see absolutely no reason why the state should be getting involved in adults' bedrooms. But again, it comes back to this moral repugnant notion that the state has this right to stop individuals doing things because, they don't like them doing them and they harm nobody else.
I think we've got a very good idea for your principles on that. But on practicalities, and at the start you mentioned education and that you were in favour of loan-funded third-level education. If that's the right principle, why not do it for primary and secondary?
Yeah, the thing is that in primary and secondary education are funded through general taxation, right? And the notion is that you can fund third level through general taxation, and then maybe you fund master's degrees through general taxation and PhD degrees through general taxation.
Come on, just give me an answer. Why not do it for primary and secondary?
I'm going to give you the answer.
Okay.
So the fact is that at some point what you have to say is there is an advantage to gaining this education. And therefore, the advantage in a society, for example, in a third world society, primary education may be an advantage. In Eastern Europe, secondary education might be an advantage. In our particular financial or economic circumstances here, third level is an economic advantage. At some point, a society is going to pick a point where they say, well, look, you're gaining so much from that really you should be paying for it yourself. Now, if you want to get back to primary and secondary education, I think we have advanced to the point now where general basic literacy and stuff is no real great advantage. It's the norm. So I have no problem if somebody wants to have kind of again, I'm not an anarchist. I have no problem if somebody wants to have a state-funded primary and secondary education. But I think you could definitely make the case that third-level education is not something that's absolutely required and necessary to live in this country, and it's definitely an advantage to have. So why should somebody who doesn't go to third-level education, for example, let's say they're working on a cash register in a supermarket, why should they pay more tax so that someone else can do a degree in, like gender studies in DCU? I don't see that.
And would you extend the same to healthcare?
Well, I definitely think if you look around the world, if you're looking at outcomes, the better systems are always those where the individual is in control of the payment to the doctor. So the NHS is the great lauded system of those who think that a state-funded healthcare system is the best, and yet it is shown to have the worst outcomes in the Western world. French and German systems, which are based more on insurance, have a better outcomes. And the American system, for all its faults in access, when you're actually in the system, it has the best outcomes.
But hang on a second. The American healthcare system receives, in absolute terms, more cash per patient than the NHS from the taxpayer.
From the taxpayer? What do you mean by that?
The US taxpayer pays more cash per individual for healthcare than the UK taxpayer does.
I don't see how you could come to that conclusion.
Because the federal government in the United States pays large amounts of taxpayers' money for various healthcare systems. The problem with the US system is that they are being outbid by private money in the system. And if you look at life expectancy and try to correlate it with either socialized or private healthcare systems, there's a very strong correlation between better life expectancy and socialized healthcare systems.
No. I think if you look at the evidence in the report that was just done for the NHS, remarkably enough, on which they said that they came out top of the pile across the world, number one in the world for access to healthcare. Mm-hmm. And in the same report, they were bottom of the pile for outcomes in healthcare. So what you're talking about is, it depends. I suppose it depends on your slant. You can say that it's the best healthcare system in the world, the NHS, because more people get into it.
Well, it's also the best value for money because the UK spends...
Well, it's not very much value for money if you keep dying.
Well, no, people don't keep dying. Some people die. You are correct that the UK has relatively poor, by Western standards, poor
the worst. No,
outcomes.
Not relatively, the worst.
Yes, I'm agreeing with you on that. But they also spend, by a wide margin, the lowest percentage of their GDP on healthcare. But on that, I mean, the bottom line is that if you go for entirely anarchistic systems, as you might say in Africa or whatever, the outcomes are horrendous because private money in the system can bid up the price far beyond the means of people, of ordinary people.
Yeah, I wouldn't go for an anarchistic system at all. What I'm suggesting to you is a system where people are in control of the fees and funds that they pay to the doctors individually. So that can be through an insurance model, it can be through private purchase, it can be through lots of different things. But what is not true is through an intermediary, the state, that has no real interest in keeping or monitoring the prices. So what happens is that, for example, I'm a dentist, right? In dentistry, if somebody comes in and they pay the dentist for a filling, they are in control of how much the filling is going to cost. They're also in control afterwards. They have a reasonable expectation of being able to say, well, look, the filling didn't work or it's broken and I want you to replace it. And there's a kind of a trade there.
Can I suggest you why that is less likely to work for healthcare? Because
dentistry is healthcare.
For more complex healthcare, because dentistry people can
I'll
understand.
Try not to take offense to that. But
I understand you're a dentist, and I'll try not to give offense. Sorry about that. What I mean is that dentistry, it's pretty clear to the patient what's going on. For more complex healthcare, if I say, doctor, I've got a fierce pain in my arm, I must have broken my arm, will you put my arm in a cast? And the doctor says, no, you don't. You've got a pain in your arm because you're having a heart attack and I'm going to give you open heart surgery. The patient has absolutely no possibility of arguing. So quite unlike dentistry, where you can say, my tooth is still sore, you didn't do the job well, or my filling fell out, you didn't do the job well. The quality of the care and the quality of the outcomes is not transparent in a huge chunk of healthcare, and that's why, unlike almost any other product where the customer can see whether they got a good deal or not, there's very little opportunity for customer-driven value in healthcare.
Okay. Well, let's take your example there where somebody goes into hospital and has to have open heart surgery. If they have private health insurance at the moment, say with VHI, they actually do receive the bill at the end because VHI pay it. Okay. So they get to see how much things are. Now, they don't really care because VHI pay it and that's fine. And what that causes then is a system where the doctor is charging, the patient doesn't care how much it costs, and the costs therefore ever spiral upwards, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a situation where, for example, the patient has insurance, so it still has VHI, but is paying, for example, a copay, and let's say it's 5%, okay? So they have to pay 5% of whatever the bill is. You can be absolutely sure there will be downward pressure on prices in healthcare because individuals will be saying, well, hold on here, I didn't have, for example, you say I was there for 2 nights. I actually left on the second evening. For example, you say I got a private room when I was only a semi-private room.
Sure, yeah, it's possible to see some of those, but most of those type of costs are not transparent to somebody who doesn't have medical qualifications.
Well, I think a lot of the main costs, i.e. how many nights you spend in the hospital, the kind of overall service that you did get, whether that hospital is better than another hospital for outcomes, all that transparency can be made available. which doctor you have, if that doctor is particularly good at open heart surgery. I mean, all of those things get driven by individuals having an individual vested interest, and generally a financial one, in the transaction. So what I'm saying to you is that if you have a financial interest in paying something, maybe not all, but something, when it comes to the medical care, I think that you get better value for money in a healthcare system.
Okay. One thing that's notable about communism, which was really created in the mid-1800s, is that it's very much a product of its era of, the robber barons were essentially setting up coal mills and steel mills, and we still kind of, in a cliche, associate that sort of thing with communism, because it was essentially a system designed to deal with heavy industry. What might be called, I think, Austrian economics, which drives a lot of libertarianism, was created around the start of the 20th century, maybe the 1920s, when totalitarianism in Europe was at its height. Isn't it true that a little bit like communism, that type of libertarianism is a product of its era, and it might not be so relevant now?
Well, I suppose you're right. I mean, libertarianism is definitely a reaction to the advent of socialism and people seeing the totalitarian aspect of socialism on the individual.
Isn't there a blind spot in libertarianism as well? Because they very, very sharply focus on the unjust use of state power and to a large degree, make valid criticisms of it, and have an entirely blind spot to the unjust use of corporate power.
Well, I mean, the state has far more power than any corporate body. I mean, the state can imprison you. Well, the state can imprison you.
Hold on for a second. You're saying Tim Cook has less power than Enda Kenny?
Well, I mean, for example, if Enda Kenny, if you want to
Enda Kenny rushing off to Europe to say, no, we're not taking that 13 billion. We want to make sure that 13 billion doesn't go into the coffers of the Irish state. We want to make sure that it goes into bank accounts in the Cayman Islands to be untaxed to the benefit of Apple shareholders. Are you really saying to me that Tim Cook has less power than Enda Kenny?
I'll happily come back and discuss that specific example to you in a moment. But when you're talking about in general, does a state have more power than a corporate body? The obvious answer is yes. I mean, a state...
It's not obvious to me.
Okay, well, let me explain it to you. The state has the ability to imprison you, take your freedom away. The state has the ability to execute you. The state has the ability to force you to work for them for the whole of your life. You look at somebody like Cuba, for example, where people are literally just trapped on an island.
Sure, that's true in extremis, but in Western, like in European democracies, that just isn't true. That doesn't happen.
Well, let me go. Okay, well, you just said it doesn't happen. I give you an example at the start of this podcast where the state is claiming ownership of individuals, for example, doctors and teachers. The new theory is that doctors and teachers will have to work for the state for a number of years because the state has educated them and therefore owns them. So it's not an extremist case. These things are never really gone too far. They're only out in the fringe, and then somebody will pull them in when they need them. So I think that the notion that Apple or Microsoft or whatever, that the CEO of this company has more power than the leader of the country that you're in, I think that's probably, to me, that's ridiculous. I think that the country obviously has the power to do whatever they want, unless you can escape.
Councillor Keith Redmond, councillor in, is it Fingal?
Fingal, yeah.
Fingal, now sitting as an independent. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
That's almost the end of episode 66 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 25th of July 2017. I have contact details for Keith and references to other information we were talking about in the show notes on the website. And I interviewed Keith because some people on a libertarian group on Facebook suggested that I should. So if you are someone or you know someone who you think I should include in a future podcast, please get in touch and do the same thing. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Keith Redmond at CLLR Redmond. And subscribe to the podcast, that's the most important thing, so then new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed with iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. And you can subscribe by email now as well. Just go on the website and you'll see where you can get an email alert each time a new podcast is up. There's full information about all of that and contact details for the show. It's all at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Liam McLaughlin. Thank you for listening.